Hello everyone, this is Addis Dialogue. I'm Sintayo Tamirat with this edition, and in this edition we will try to look into issues like US government critical involvement in the Ethiopian internal affairs and the election of Ethiopia. Is that a kind of healthy election procedure? Does it meet international standards? And my guest today is Ethiopian well-known politician Andargachew Tsige. Thank you, Andargachew Tsige, for coming to Addis Dialogue.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start it with the recent decision of the Ethiopian government to designate TPLF and Shene as terrorist groups. And is that right and timely decision?
I mean, there were precedents in Ethiopia in the past where organizations were labeled as terrorist organizations. Organizations like my own organization, Gimbot 7, the OLF, the ONLF, and just compare the situation or the condition at which we were labeled terrorists. In fact, those days, and the reason we couldn't actually participate within Ethiopia in the peaceful and legal way within Ethiopia was there was no political space that allows any opposition to operate freely, and in fact it was a very tyrannical dictatorial regime that was in place. And it's that regime, in fact, that labeled us terrorist. And now there is another round of labeling organizations as terrorists. Let's take the condition now. In fact, all organizations, including us, that were labeled terrorists, believed, in fact, there is favorable condition in Ethiopia to work, to operate legally and peacefully, and has come in fact, has come back, from exile. A number of other organizations like ONLF, OLF, or other organizations has come back because they believed, in fact, the situation favors a very peaceful and legal political activity. Has the situation changed in Ethiopia to such extent, or the political space has been shut to that extent for other organizations that are like the TPLF or the Shene to engage in illegal activities, to engage in violent activities? In my view, it is not shut. There is a favorable, though not perfect, but there was room for peaceful, legal, political practice and activity in Ethiopia. And if you compare the two different labelings, the ones that were made by the TPLF when it was in power, and the one that is made by the current regime, there are two different conditions. And I believe, in fact, in the past, labeling opposition groups as terrorists had no justification because the political space was totally shut. At the present time, the political space, though it is not perfect, but it is something that you can operate in. So any organization that resorts to violence, to illegal means of achieving its political end and causing mayhem and chaos in the country is justifiably labeled as terrorist organization. And I have no qualms, in fact, even though I was labeled a terrorist at one time, there is no reason that I should object the measure taken by the current regime to call this organization as terrorist. They use violence, they use illegal means. They will not abide really by the law, the rules of the country to engage in politics. That's it. What else do you want? Any organization that operates outside the legal means is is it a terrorist organization as far as I'm concerned. Really.
Ethiopia's law enforcement measures in Tigray region has been just drawing concerns among the global community, and governments like the US are trying to intervene in this situation, which Ethiopia says it is its own internal affairs. And they are also trying to put pressures on Ethiopia through the UN Security Council. The US, for example, made it clear with its latest statement that the Ethiopian government shall withdraw some of its forces deployed in western Tigray region. Can governments like the US intervene in the matters of a sovereign country in such a way? And is there some hidden interest behind this, as some Ethiopians argue?
I think to a Western audience, I have to say a few things before I reply to your question. What sort of really fortunate fate the TPLF had been given compared to all rulers in the past. You can take, I mean, in my lifetime, this is the third change I'm witnessing. The first one was the removal of really the regime of Emperor Haile Selassie. And what happened to the high officials of that regime? They were buried in a mass grave. They were massacred, in fact. They were expropriated. Their family suffered a lot. Well, that's one. When the change came in 1974, this is what happened to the ruling class, the ruling elite. Same thing happened to the military regime, what we call Derg. What happened when the TPLF took power? Thousands of ex-government officials, military leaders were incarcerated. They were imprisoned for years. Some of them were sentenced 20 years in prison. And the suffering that their family faced was enormous. And now we came to the overthrow of the TPLF regime. Ethiopians, in fact, learned from the past, and they said, in fact, there should not be any bloodshed anymore. We should not be vindictive. There should not be retributive justice. We should put an end to that history. And even a person who has suffered in the hands of the TPLF, like me, was willing to forgive, in fact, the crimes they committed personally, and I have expressed this wish in the open. And I believe this is really the view of the entire majority of the Ethiopian people. Let bygones be bygones. We're not going to be vindictive. Let there be a reconciliation. Let there be no more bloodshed. I mean, that if you compare the crime that TPLF committed to the crimes that were committed by the regime of Emperor Haile Selassie and the military regime that succeeded it, the TPLF crimes were more heinous. And they would have made really people to demand an eye for an eye sort of thing. But that wasn't demanded. They were given ample opportunity to live their life peacefully, to engage in politics, to keep the wealth they plundered, in fact, and exercise economic influence from the wealth they plundered the nation. Nobody was demanding really anything that would damage their interest, but they chose, in fact, to go into a war they initiated. We know exactly what they did. They attacked the Northern Command. They attacked soldiers in their sleep. They attacked the soldiers that defended them, in fact, from foreign aggression for 20 years. They attacked soldiers that participated in the development of Tigray, who were building clinics, roads, and schools. And the law enforcement task of the state began as a result of this wanton act taken by the TPLF regime. So they were given ample opportunity, in fact, to be part of the change. But they refused to do that, and they went beyond that, in fact, to reverse the change according to their will. So what the government did in Tigray was not as they claim to attack TPLF, or sometimes they associate TPLF with the Tigray people to attack the Tigrayan people. In fact, every precaution not to slide back into violence, into bloodshed, was taken by the people of Ethiopia and the Ethiopian state. So this is the basis on which the Ethiopian government was forced to engage in law enforcement. The second issue, as you raised, no country, whether it is US or UK or any other country, has the right to ask, demand the withdrawal of troops from Ethiopia, the Eritrean troops, or troops like the Amara Special Force from Tigray. It is entirely the right, the legal sovereign right of the Ethiopian government to demand, to call any nation for help. If Ethiopia believes its national interest demands the involvement of troops from Russia, it can do that. If it wants to involve troops from Eritrea, it is the right of Ethiopia, not it is the American right to object or to accept. Ethiopia have never questioned the American involvement in many wars. In wars, in fact, where they committed egregious crimes, against the populations all over the world. I mean, they have gone outside their country, invading others, destroying nations, and killing in mass, populations. What Ethiopia is doing is preserving its national sovereignty, keeping its peace, and enforcing law within its sovereign territory. So Ethiopia should not listen to any lecture, should not give attention to any of the demands that is being put to America. They have absolutely no right. We can call it really demeaning demand. That's what they are doing. They are showing contempt to the nation of Ethiopia and its people. So they have no right.
Some people like Lawrence Freeman, who is just known political and economist analyst for Africa, he says that the U.S. current position is just based on reports by some media, which is misreported, and also by the Amnesty International. So what is your reaction for this?
The way I see things is the position of the American government has nothing to do with evidence, has nothing to do with misrepresentation or proper representing of the facts there. They have a hidden agenda, the Americans. They want a regime in Ethiopia that they can dictate. They want a very weak Ethiopia they can manipulate. Whether there is evidence or not, it is irrelevant to the Americans. They will be using any other pretext to undermine Ethiopia. So we should be very careful, in fact, when we talk about Americans being misinformed by others. It's not misinformed. They know exactly what goes on in Tigray. I don't have the evidences. I've never been there. I haven't sent an independent body to investigate what goes on in Tigray. So I will not argue on the basis of really whether the reports were right or wrong. But knowing the very nature of the Western governments, they don't need any evidence. If they don't like you, if they believe they are not serving their interest, they will do whatever they can do to undermine you. This is what is happening in Ethiopia. Nothing to do with the war in Tigray. In fact, Americans, even if there isn't any law enforcing measures being taken in Tigray, they will come up with another excuse. Probably use the coming up election, which they are using. Probably they would use the filling of the guard, and using Egypt and Sudan, in fact, to undermine Ethiopia. The very question we should ask is why are the Americans doing it? Why are the UK doing this? There are other issues. There are global foreign relation related issues that are in play here. There is a battle between the new upcoming bloc, the Chinese, the Russia, the Indian bloc, and the old bloc that had dominated really the world in the past 100 years, like the Western bloc. And this is the game they are playing. They don't want an independent Ethiopia that can decide its position in foreign relation independently. They want it to be the same way it was in the past, as a lucky to Western governments.
Let me just compare the involvement of the US into Israel-Hamas war. US President Joe Biden has said two remarks in relation with this one. The first is Israel can defend itself, while the second one, which he said on Tuesday, is that the US supports the ceasefire, which is still just in the interest of one side. But when it comes to Ethiopia, the US is attempting to enforce withdrawal of the army, the military army, which Ethiopia deployed in Tigray region. So what is your take on this?
Israel is a very strong and reliable ally in the eyes of the Americans. So anything what the Israelis do against Palestinians is acceptable. I mean, their history is full of really decisions that doesn't reflect on the sort of, these noble principles of democracy and human rights they claim to uphold. We've seen them getting involved in countries like Chile, bringing down a democratically elected president and being the means that president being murdered in his own palace. We've seen in the Americans getting involved, supporting despotic regimes in Latin America that were killing and imprisoning people in mass. We've seen the Americans getting involved in some of these Arab countries where you see no democracy, no respect of really human rights, where equality of gender is totally absent. If you look into the positions they have taken throughout their history, it has nothing to do with this noble idea of justice, equality, freedom, or democracy. It is based on their interest, narrow international, economic, military, and diplomatic interest.
History tells us that some charity organizations helped the Nazi leaders flee Germany during World War II. And some Ethiopians are trying to make connection between this and the current demands of the US government to withdraw some military from Western Tigray, as if the US is trying to let the TPLF leaders escape to Sudan, freeing that area.
I can tell you, the American government will not give a damn, I can use that word, what happens to Debrecen or Getachew Reda or some of the criminals that have been hunted by the Ethiopian government. Not forget, in fact, of these sorts of low-life officials in Ethiopia. They will not be bothered about really their allies, that serve them well. This is the reason why they are demanding is not really to because they like or love these guys, but bringing such demand would cause chaos here. It would give encouragement, in fact, to lawlessness here. It would give encouragement to criminal elements, and that helps to destabilize Ethiopia. They don't have. I don't believe they have love, for individuals like that. I don't think these guys appear really in the radars of really U.S. calculation. Their calculation is based on one thing: the more they demand, in fact, the inclusion of the TPLF in national dialogue. That's what they are demanding, and the more they demand, the Oneg Shegne type of government organizations in the national dialogue, the more they demand, in fact, that individuals like the Brazilian and the others are allowed, in fact, to come back, to the political fold. They know that involving these elements will weaken really the Ethiopian state. They know that will make it malleable for manipulation. That's their only interest is. They're not interested in individuals. They have a bigger agenda. These are pawns. Getachew Reda or whatever you call it, the Brazilian, or other organized elements are a pawn in the bigger chess game, political chess game for the Americans. We should not make a mistake. They are trying to favor really TPLF or officials of TPLF.
Well, let's turn our attention to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam issue, and the tension is with regard to the Grand Ethiopian renaissance dam among Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt has somehow calmed so far for the last 2 weeks. That is since the Israel-Hamas conflict has begun, and critics regarding this justify this happened because the major actors of this dialogue or debate are already engaged in the conflict between Israel and Hamas. What is your reflection on this, sir?
The cause of Palestinians is always has always been really a concern for the Arab regimes. You know, Egypt as being one of the main partner in the Arab League, it couldn't really shut its eyes and just go on as life as normal while the Palestinians are bombarded, you know, to such extent by Israel. I have a feeling, in fact, the Israelis have sensed that the Egyptians are doing something, you know, behind their backs, and there has been, I think, some kind of press release, or I think I saw a statement by the Israeli spokesman condemning, in fact, you know, the activities of Egypt. So Egypt now is more or less engaged, you know, in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and its attention has been drawn now towards this issue. But they haven't forgotten really the Kurd issue anyway. They will come back to it once the Palestinian and Israeli problem cools down.
You have been actively engaged in the Ethiopian politics since you were a university student, if I am not mistaken. And you can witness the election procedures of the previous regimes. How do you compare the current government's commitment and preparation to hold democratic election?
Well, there has been elections in the past in Ethiopia. There were elections during the regime of Emperor Haile Selassie. But those elections characterize the nature of the imperial state. In fact, I don't have to go into details. Those who wanted to be candidates were selected, in fact, by being landowners or property owners. In fact, there was no right, you know, for any candidate, for any person to become a candidate for parliament. But there was an election. There was an election during the military government, an election that is closely associated with the nature of a Marxist regime. So there was no really political pluralism, there were no opposition parties. And the third election that we saw was the past 5 elections conducted in Ethiopia by the TPLF. They were given the veneer of a democratic election, but they were absolutely similar to what not different really from what the military regime used to do, to conduct as in the name of election. No democratic election would produce a result that 100% of the seat in parliament is won by one party, a ruling party. That tells you, in fact, the sort of election they were conducting. The past six elections in Ethiopia were sham elections. To start with, the first one or the second one, the opposition party were not strong enough, in fact, to contest. So it was a contest. There was no contest. It was the ruling party, the TPLF, or the EPRDF, that won almost every seat. But the only time we saw a bit of a proper election looking competition is in 2005. Even in 2005, when the result went against the ruling party, the EPRDF, they reversed it, in fact, you know, the will of the people using violence, imprisoned hundreds of thousands, exiled literally nearly 1 million people were exiled as a result of the crisis that came after the election. They put elected parliamentarians in prison, and that 2005 election ended up in tragedy. And that said, the rest of the elections, the 2 elections, were conducted in a country where the political space were totally shut to opposition groups. And that was the reason why the ruling party claimed to have won 100% of the seat in parliament. So there were no democratic elections in Ethiopia, you could say. This is the 6th one. This is different from the others One, it is being conducted in a country that faces a number of challenges. There are challenges from foreign powers, the sort of challenge that is being raised, by countries that had no business to interfere in Ethiopian business, like the Americans and the US, the UK, and the Europeans, and at the same time, those countries that have interest in the filling of the GERD, the Egypt and Sudan. There are internal challenges, so there are a number of places where a peace and security issue is still a challenge. On the economic front, there is a spiraling inflation. There is huge youth unemployment. The current election is taking place in a country where all these challenges are prevailing. So it's not a simple task now. It's not easy to conduct election as if the country is in a normal state. So we have to accept that this election is taking place in a situation where there are extraordinary challenges. And then we come back to the question you raised. Despite the country is facing this extraordinary challenge, we can see the election is taking place in a more or less widened political space. This is not just a propaganda. I can tell the media. There are a number of private television and radio stations and individuals, organized groups, political parties. Their views have been freely expressed. That was not possible in the past. That's a major achievement. In the past, the electoral board was totally controlled by the ruling party. All those who served in the electoral board were elected by the ruling party. So more or less, the electoral board was another extension of the ruling party, but not anymore. No, it is led by a very independent and very powerful and very principled lady, Birtukan Medeksa, and the members of the board were assembled by her. So we can vouch for the independence of the board, which that wasn't there before. On other fronts, even though it is not complete, even though it's not to the standard that we like, but there was an attempt to make some of the major institutions like the defense institution, like the police, the federal police, like the security, the intelligence service, more or less really an independent institution, more that would probably will not be interested in serving the ruling party as it used to do in the past, in the time of election. So that's another development. Of course, at the same time, there are issues that raise the effectiveness of this election. There are places where opposition parties could not campaign because of the security problem. There are places, in fact, where the opposition parties cannot freely campaign, not because the state is putting the barrier, but other opposition groups are putting the barrier. In fact, in Ethiopia now we have a very strange situation. In the past, we were blaming the state for being the number one aggressor of human rights and not respecting its own laws and the restricting democratic rights. But now the government is not totally free from this. There are still there are a number of things it still has to work to bring it really to perfection. A lot still remains to be done. But at the same time, a very strange development has happened in Ethiopia. Opposition groups have become, in fact, are playing a role that TPLF or the APRDF used to play in the past. They have organized military groups attacking civilians. In the past, it was the state, in fact, that was attacking civilians. There are political groups now that deny the right of other political groups to operate in certain areas. So now we have, in fact, we face a problem not only from the state, but from opposition groups itself. This shows, in fact, how our democracy is not well developed, how the Ethiopian political elite is not mature enough to play the democratic and the legal and lawful game. So this election has got a lot of benefits when compared to past elections, but it's got as well very serious challenge. Under this challenge, to claim that it would fulfill all internationally accepted standards for an election would be a folly. There would be always a shortcoming. But what choice Ethiopia has, whether to conduct an election in such situation or not to conduct the election at all. And in my understanding, in fact, not having an election would cause more damage to the country, to the stability and security of the country, even to deepen the change that has come about 3 years ago.
When you say just it is a sort of democratic election procedure, does it meet some most of the international standards of election?
You know, the Americans, the European Union, I don't know what the UK had said, they will not send election observers as they used to send.
Let's say just some globally accepted principles.
The problem is, you see, in Ethiopia, it has got its own challenge. It is conducting election under this challenge. So probably international standards probably are set in a country, assuming all things are favorable to conduct election. But all these things, all the factors say that there is challenge integrate, there is challenge in law and security issue in different parts of the country. There are other challenges as well in the economic front. There are other challenges in Ethiopia. Under such condition, what does it mean really an election fulfilling an international standard? This is not an election that is taking place under a condition that prevails in the UK or in the US or in any European country or even in some other African countries, even Kenya. The election that took place in Kenya is completely different condition than the condition that prevails in Ethiopia. So what is that international standard you want to apply to Ethiopia? The only thing you can ask is there freedom of the press here? Are opposition parties allowed to express their views freely? Yes. Would the supporters of opposition groups be allowed to give their vote freely wherever there is an election post? If that answer is right, yes. If the result of election is properly counted with proper election observers, without anyone cheating anybody else, if that is okay, that's another standard being met. Is the result of the election is properly announced to the general public without any mischief? If that is completed, that's another standard. So if you take all this put together, despite that the election hasn't really universally taken all over the country at one time, still there is an election that has met the international standard. But we are halfway through that. We haven't reached to the polling day. We don't know how people would practice their right at the polling day. We don't know the role of election observers, their neutrality at election day. We don't know really how flawless the election count is going to be. But as far as I'm concerned, the steps that has been taken so far are democratic by any standard.
Thank you, Andargachew Tsige, for sharing us your views on a number of issues regarding the U.S. current stance on Ethiopia, the situation in Tigray, the border disputes with Sudan and the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam, as well as just the ongoing election procedures in Ethiopia. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dear Addis Dialogue viewers, this has been the conversation with Andargachew Tsige, who is well-known Ethiopian opposition politician. Thank you for joining Addis Dialogue.